Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to finish my set of reviews on the Chronicles of Narnia by sharing some thoughts on Book 7 in the Chronicles of Narnia series, The Last Battle, written by C.S. Lewis. If you've been following this channel, you'll know that over the course of the last year or so, I've been reading through the Narnia books with my girls in the evenings, and we just finished this the other day. And the girls were very excited to read the book, very excited to finish, and it was a great experience for me, as I've mentioned, I think with all these reviews, not only to reread this book. It's one that I read a lot as a kid and have continued to read this series as an adult, but to read it with my own kids is just a unique experience. It's wonderful. So let me share kind of what this book is doing, what Lewis is doing in this book, and then some thoughts and highlights that stand out to me from it. So this is, as I said, the last book in the Narnia series, and it really is a fitting end to the series. Lewis at one point said that when he was kind of writing the Narnia books, he wrote the first three, and he thought for a while that The Voyage of the Dawn Treader might be the last book in the series, just it would be kind of a trilogy. And when you kind of go back and read through those first three books, you can see, yeah, they hold together in a certain sense. There's a sort of fitting end. There's a nod to Aslan's country and everything at the end of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But of course, Lewis's ideas and genius kept flowing, and there were four more books to come after that. But I think The Last Battle is in many ways the perfect end to the series, because we are brought not just at the end of the series, but to the end of Narnia itself. If The Magician's Nephew is sort of telling us the story of the creation of Narnia, The Last Battle is telling us the story of the end of Narnia, or, as we'll come to see, in many ways, the consummation of Narnia. But the way that he does that is by beginning not with human characters in our own world, which is how most of the Narnia books begin. Actually, all of them except The Horse and His Boy, which doesn't have any moving from our world to Narnia. All the other books begin in our world with human children who are then brought into Narnia, and then it tells their story. The Last Battle takes it from the other vantage point. It begins in Narnia, and then it's only partway through the book that the human characters, in this case Eustace and Jill initially, are brought into the world. So he's doing something a little bit different there. That itself sort of tells you something about what's going on. And it begins when these two animals up in the north part of Narnia, out on the edge of the country, find this lion skin. And there's this conniving ape and this gullible donkey. And the ape ends up tying the lion skin to the donkey and uses that as kind of a ruse to pretend that the donkey is Aslan. So what we have here is the ape setting up this kind of Antichrist figure who sort of is meant to represent Aslan but isn't actually. And the ape ends up using this false Aslan to kind of convince the other animals to do what he wants, to give him what he wants. And we find out as the story unfolds that there's kind of this unholy alliance that has formed around the ape and this false Aslan and the Calormans, who have, if you've read the other books, you know, they're kind of the country that's always looking to kind of gain ascendancy in Narnia and take over the Narnian people. And so the story unfolds with that thread and with Tirian, the last king of Narnia, and that's how we're introduced to him as one of the last kings of Narnia, who is trying to fight against this and stand against this. And the book, as it unfolds then, you know, ends up going in a very different direction than you might think, because you would expect this to be an example of, you know, some great threat coming to Narnia and then good rising up and overcoming it. That's the story that we've read again and again and again throughout these books. But The Last Battle takes a totally different direction. What ends up happening is that the good guys end up being killed or defeated or deceived, and it looks like the good side has lost. And yet what we end up finding is that all of these terrible events that have been going on are Narnia's last days. And so we end up seeing the end of Narnia and the judgment on all of the enemies of Aslan, and the entering into eternity of all of those who follow Aslan. So what Lewis is doing in The Last Battle is sort of giving us, in a sense, his eschatology, his view of the last things, in the form of a Narnia story, in the same way that the magician's nephew was giving his views of creation, the beginning of all things, in the form of a Narnia story. So they form a natural pair. This is another reason why I like the publication order, because when you do it in publication order, you end up reading The Magician's Nephew and then you go straight to The Last Battle. So you get those side by side, and the contrast and interplay between them becomes even more evident and obvious. So this story, and I left out a lot in terms of the nuts and bolts of the plot development, because I don't want to ruin every twist and turn, but the story as a whole sort of functions then to talk about how Narnia ends up declining, and the challenges that the faithful Narnians, Tyrion, Eustace, Jill, Jewel the Unicorn, Poggin the Dwarf, all these figures have. And then it, in the last few chapters, it describes the life to come, eternity, heaven, Narnia consummated. And it's that part of the book that I think, for many people, certainly for me, is the most compelling and interesting part of the story. It's fascinating to see Lewis kind of tease out the story of Narnia's end and decline. But then as you kind of come into the new world, you realize that what looked like the defeat of Aslan and the defeat of Aslan's purposes was actually the completion of them. That Aslan was in charge of the whole thing, in a sense, and was using this to bring Narnia to a close, because all worlds have to end. And the end of all worlds, the telos, the purpose, is found in Aslan and in Aslan's country. And so Lewis ends up kind of fleshing that out. What does that look like? And so there's a couple of things that stand out to me from the book. One is the wonderful way in which Lewis fleshes out the diversity of opposition to Aslan. So on the one hand, you have characters like the ape, who are purely kind of pragmatist. He doesn't really view Aslan as being real, which is why he's willing to commit kind of the blasphemy of dressing up this donkey as a false Aslan. He's just looking to gain power for himself, to make the world in his image, and religion, in a sense, becomes a means for him to do that. Interestingly, he's paired up with another character called Rishtatar Khan, a Calorman kind of aristocrat, who has a similar view about the god of his country, Tash. He doesn't really think that he's real. And so they end up kind of manufacturing this false god, Tashlan, that they sort of say is this combination of Aslan and Tash. And they say all religions are pointing towards the same thing, and that's what we're kind of wanting to reorient people towards. And so on the one hand, you get these people who are sort of using religion and religious belief as a plaything to just advance their earthly ends or goals. On the other side of things, though, you have the dwarves, who are these interesting characters in the last battle, who end up basically not wanting to be deceived. And so they end up sort of putting themselves outside of the camp of those who are for Aslan or against Aslan, to just say, the dwarves are for the dwarves. That's the mantra they keep repeating. And Lewis fleshes out how that posture of kind of suspicion and self-protection ends up being self-defeating, because even when the dwarves are kind of brought into Aslan's country, they can't see it, they can't appreciate it, they can't taste it, they can't experience it. And so he's commenting there on the paradox that when we're so suspicious of what's outside of us, that we don't want to be taken in, that we end up taking in ourselves. We end up, if we're so worried about being deceived that we won't trust anyone else, we end up deceiving ourselves, and the dwarves become kind of a picture of that. So you have this interesting, complex relationship of, the different forms that self-deception, spiritual death, darkness, and opposition can take. Interestingly, this is one of the most controversial parts of not just The Last Battle, but kind of Lewis's Narnia series as a whole. there's a character called Emeth, who is a young Calorman soldier who has given his whole life to following and worshiping Tash, who is the kind of god of the Calormans, who gets brought into Aslan's country, but he's treated not as an enemy of Aslan, but as a son or friend of Aslan. And many people have seen this as Lewis sort of creating space for people who were not Christians, self-consciously Christians, to still be saved, provided they're living virtuous, ethical lives or aiming or orienting towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. I think, based on what I've read of Lewis, that he probably does want to leave a kind of category for that. I think you see this movement, it's become a more popular idea in the 20th century, with Karl Rahner and others, of sort of anonymous Christians, people who maybe they're growing up in Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism or something else, but they're seeking to live moral lives and aiming for truth and so forth. And so some theologians want to say, well, that there's still a possibility of salvation there. I think searching older back, which may be more of Lewis's influences, there were some in the early church, for example, who wrestled with okay, what do you do with the virtuous pagans, the Aristotles and the Platos and figures like that seem to have insight into right and wrong and the nature of reality? Is there any possibility of salvation for them? And some fathers said yes, some fathers said no. So this has been a kind of question that Christians have wrestled with. I think Lewis is probably responding to those concerns by trying to carve out this space for sort of honest seekers to still find Christ, even if they don't know the name of Christ. However, I do think this is one of the great flaws in Lewis's theology and in his writing. It's something that, as you're reading this yourself or as you're reading it to your kids, it's important to be discerning. In fact, this prompted some good conversations when we were reading it to say, what do you think Lewis is saying? And we kind of talked about that. And we said, okay, what does the Bible say about this? Because, of course, the scripture is very clear that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the way in which that coming to Christ and coming to the Father through Christ happens is by calling on the name of Christ, by having a relationship with Christ, by having faith in, receiving and resting upon Christ alone as he's offered to us in the gospel, and by repenting of our sin. And I think one of the flaws that feeds Lewis's misunderstanding of this question is that he assumes that it's possible for fallen unbelievers to still do what is good. And so that's sort of what he ends up arguing in the book, is not that, worshiping Tash is no different than worshiping Aslan. He makes a point of saying those are different things, those are different people. But what Aslan says to Emeth is, everything that you did that was good is always done to me. And everything that's done wickedly, even in my name, is always done to Tash, That logic checks out if people are actually able to do things that are good in God's sight. But the Bible paints a very different picture of humanity. It paints us as being dead in our trespasses and sins, the thoughts of our hearts as being only evil continually. And so I think Lewis appreciates the anthropology that the Bible gives us and the significance and seriousness of sin, and therefore he's not able to respond as biblically as he ought to the question of unbelievers who have never heard of Christ. And the Bible makes it very clear that the only hope anyone has of salvation is knowing and calling on the person and work of Christ. So I think that's a problem in Lewis's writing. I do not think it's a disqualifying problem. I think it prompts a good discussion. It prompts a good conversation. For us, it was good. My girls have really come to love Narnia and C.S. Lewis. So it was a good kind of object lesson to say, hey, even someone like Lewis that we appreciate, who can help us understand things about God and can write these beautiful stories, is not infallible, is not perfect. The Bible is the only book that we can believe everything we read in. So I think that would be my encouragement to parents. Use it as a conversation object lesson. Use it as something to discuss, not as something to disqualify the book, because it is a phenomenal book. And I think the most compelling thing, as I said before, is the way that heaven and eternal life is portrayed. There's this wonderful phrase where as the true Narnians who have been kind of brought through the destruction are there in Aslan's country, they're being called to go further up and further in. And the idea is that, in heaven, it's not that you go from the real world where we live today to a kind of ethereal, you know, in unreal world in eternity, you know, but that re, eternity is the place of deepest reality, and that the further up and the further in you go, the closer to the core, the more you encounter what is really real truth, real goodness, real beauty, all flowing from the being and the character of God Himself. And Lewis himself is very explicit that what he's doing here is giving us a biblically informed kind of Christian Platonism in his ideas of reality, eternity, all of those types of things. So it raises a lot of good questions about what will heaven be like, how should we conceptualize heaven, how much continuity is there between this world and the world to come, what do we mean when we say that the new heavens and the new earth is a consummation? You know, I would not take, and I don't think Lewis wants us to take, his description of heaven or eternity as journalistic. It's not a literal description, but it is suggestive of lines of thought that show us how he was conceptualizing heaven. In the same way that his book, The Great Divorce, is not his description of what he thinks hell is like. It's suggesting lines of thought to help us understand something about the nature of hell, in the same way that this is showing us something about the nature of heaven and of eternity. So, again, I wouldn't take this as his theological treatise, and I wouldn't assume that even what he is showing of his theology is automatically true, but it's certainly richly suggestive, and it's something that is worth kind of engaging with and taking back to the scriptures and thinking through what the scriptures say and the implications of what the scriptures say to help us understand how we can think about and how we can look for and long for heaven and eternity. So this book is a phenomenal and fitting ending to the Narnia stories. It's different, not only structurally, as I mentioned, but it has, for much of the book, it has a darker tone, because there aren't the upturns. You know, we're used to sort of saying, okay, there's the crisis, and then the crisis is being overcome, but that doesn't come until very much at the end, which is itself, I think, significant, that it's not a quick resolution. So as you're reading through it, especially with kids, you can see them kind of wrestling with it. It's often a different kind of story than what they're used to. They're used to a more straightforward, you know, everything is good, everything is bad, good wins over bad, you know, we're back to normal kind of thing. And this has a more realistic and darker, in a sense, view of life, and yet it's one that's ultimately one of the most hopeful and beautiful of the books. So, phenomenal resource, a wonderful story, very well told, lots of things to talk about, lots of things to think about in terms of how we think about heaven and God and eternity and the end of all things. So, something that's worth reading if you haven't read it, or rereading and working through with your kids. So I very much enjoyed this. I enjoyed reading through the whole Narnia series. I enjoyed putting together these videos, and I hope they've been helpful to you. So those are my thoughts, or at least some of my thoughts, on C.S. Lewis's book, The Last Battle.